Working now? Oh, it is working now. Perfect. Sorry about that. I had to restart my setup here. Getting some weird error messages. Let me know if you are here in the comments. So we finished off yesterday. You guys would have watched this introductory video to ATP, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail today. Is this popping up on the screen? Why isn't this working? Oh, there it goes. And sort of the idea of the energy transfer system in humans, or in organisms in general, which I think that you, again, are vaguely familiar with. You know about cellular respiration, the opposite of photosynthesis, but we never really talk about what you actually get out of cellular respiration. I mean, we say energy, which is like a very nebulous term, like energy. Like, what does that mean exactly? So there's a little bit more to the story than just like the basic formula for respiration. And this video talks a little bit about the idea that ATP really is the format of that energy that you have in your cells. It's not sort of this just like nebulous idea that your cells are infused with energy. The energy is stored as ATP, and then various processes in your cell can break down ATP and use the energy that's stored in those chemical bonds in like the final step to actually use that energy. And then any remainder that doesn't get actually converted into work is just released as heat. So so that's how that kind of ties all of the systems together that we're going to talk about. We talked about the digestive system, which is where you get your chemical energy molecule, the sugar or fats. They're pretty much interchangeable for energy use. That's the digestive component. The respiratory component, which we're going to get into now, is where you get the gas component of that, the oxygen. And it's all about getting the oxygen into your body and transporting it to your cells. So the getting it into your body is the respiratory system, and the transporting it to your cells is the circulatory system, which is the last system that we're going to discuss. So anyway, this provided you with like a little bit of an introduction. Today's day 12, by the way, although I'm sure you already know that. So before we get into today's lesson, I'm actually going to send you guys out away for a second to watch this video. And this video is going to go into why it's important to put your mask on first when there is a depressurization in an airplane. Okay, and so this is going to examine the issue of pressure, partial pressure, and I want you to pay special attention to how long it actually takes when you lose oxygen transport into your circulatory system, how long it takes before you start really experiencing some severe problems. So this is a great video. They're going to take him up here to altitude, basically, and then he's going to take his oxygen mask off. And up to altitude, it's being done in like a pressure chamber, so he's not actually going up, but it's like a simulated going up to altitude. And then they're going to give him some tasks to do to sort of show the acuity and the ability for his brain to process and for his motor neurons to like move his hands around and stuff like that. And I want you to actually take a look here at how profoundly it affects it. Even when, and by the way, all the oxygen is not being removed from his environment. Only some of the oxygen is being removed from his environment. Because he's not really, they're not really taking him up that high. So, anyway, they go through a bunch of this stuff in the video, but just pay attention to how quickly, once you start perfusing your cells properly with oxygen, you start to lose your cognitive abilities, and have a look at what that actually looks like in a human, because I think it's very fascinating. So anyway, I'm going to get you to watch this. It takes about 11 minutes. And I'm going to make reference to this afterwards when we do the note together. So I will see you guys at 8:46. I think that should give you enough time. Yep. Yeah, 8:46. Okay, see you in a bit. Hopefully you guys have had an opportunity to watch the video at this point. So Just to go over sort of the general procession of what we're going to cover today. We're going to go through a note together that is a summary of how we get oxygen in, what forces are causing oxygen to enter the body through the respiratory system. And then we're also going to get into the anatomy of the respiratory system. We're going to look at the different components and the structures on those components that have various functions that are related to respiration, like filtering the air, moisturizing the air, allowing gas to move across a membrane, etc. Okay, so we're going to go, that's what the note is all about. If you're looking for the note, it's right here. There's a link. And so you'll need to download that and open it up in Cami. You okay, love? So if you've done that, like I said, we're going to proceed through that. I have a little sort of a bonus video that you can watch if you're interested. I don't know why it says it's age restricted. It's just a video of somebody having a bronchoscopy, which is essentially having a scope put up through their nose, back, down through their oral pharynx, and then into the larynx, trachea, all the way down into the respiratory system, and it allows you to see what the anatomy actually looks like on the inside. The person is like talking, and they get them to like make a sound and stuff while you're looking at their vocal cords, so you can see how the vocal cords operate. It's a pretty cool video. There's also a bunch of extra stuff in this video, like they talk about the anesthetic and a whole bunch of, it's kind of irrelevant to the course, so you can kind of fast forward around, but like if you want, it's a really cool video that shows what the actual anatomy looks like inside the respiratory system. So I threw that up there. I have no idea why a video like that would be age restricted. Children can't see the respiratory system. I don't know. I don't know what the purpose of that. But and then in block 2, we're going to take a look at some occasions where the respiratory system malfunctions. So what if your respiratory system isn't working properly? What diseases or illnesses can arise from dysfunction of the respiratory system? And that's what we're going to cover today. So, and then tomorrow, and by tomorrow I mean Monday, we're going to finish up just a little tiny bit of the respiratory system, and then we're going to get into circulatory system and talk about blood vessels and stuff like that. Okay, so hopefully at this point you got the note open. I'm sure, oh, where'd my pen go? I'm sure you're aware, you know that most organisms require oxygen to survive, and they use oxidative respiration in order to survive. Certainly all animals do. Now, we did talk about some microbes that are anaerobes, obligate and facultative anaerobes, which generally don't use oxygen to survive. But other than those, for the most part, organisms are using cellular respiration. So how do they do that? Well, I think that you're already familiar with the idea of the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. That's where these chemical reactions are taking place to convert your fuel, the sugar. And you guys have seen this formula before. This is the formula for cellular respiration. I'm going to have to restart this. I can already tell it's chugging. Sorry. Oops. Much better. There you go. So you guys have seen this formula before. In order to respire, you need oxygen, which you got to breathe in. We're going to be talking about that component today. You need some type of hydrocarbon molecule. Humans tend to prefer sugars, although fats are just as good. They're both hydrocarbons. We talked about the biochemistry of it just a touch in the digestive system, this idea that fats are made out of a glycerol and 3 fatty acids, and the fatty acids are just carbons linked together in a big long chain. So that's very similar to sugar. And sugars are just carbons that are linked together in a pentagon, basically. So your body is well equipped to use either of those configurations of hydrocarbon. The formula is usually written as glucose, just because that is the primary sugar that is being used in this process. But technically, you can convert hydrocarbons in fats, like the fatty acids, into what is essentially glucose through some enzymes, and then it just gets inserted into this process as well. So keep in mind that this molecule here is flexible. It does not have to specifically be glucose. Some organisms are a little bit more specific in what they'll accept for an energy molecule, but animals in general are fairly flexible, and they can usually substitute fat and carbohydrates. So anyway, we have this component, we have the energy molecule component, and then the products. So another component of the respiratory system here is to remove the products of cellular respiration. So you're producing CO2 in your cells as they are making energy through cellular respiration, and you have to get rid of the CO2. We'll talk a little bit about CO2 transport in the circulatory system, because it's dissolved in the blood, and it also binds to hemoglobin, which is the main chemical in the circulatory system that is binding to gases to transport them. It's found in red blood cells. So really that's what we're going to be talking about mostly today, the two highlighted parts here. We're going to be talking about the oxygen, how do we get it in, and the CO2, how do we get it out. That's what the respiratory system is responsible for here. There is, I'm sort of as a byproduct here going to talk a little bit about the energy component. It was mentioned in the video, this idea of ATP. So I want to really quickly talk about the biochemistry of ATP. There it is right there. It has three components. This is probably one of the most, if not the most important biomolecule, because it is the energy molecule of virtually every organism. So organisms use this energy molecule to send packets of energy around the cell. And usually in the course of cellular respiration, when we're talking about making energy, what we're really talking about is making ATP. So you make ATP, and then you can release the energy in the ATP to specific biochemical reactions within the cell. Do you need, I mean, we already talked about DNA synthesis or RNA synthesis, making an RNA molecule. You know how like the enzyme zips across and builds an RNA off of DNA in transcription, right? Taking you way back here to the genetics unit. Wait, we did genetics, right? Yeah, we did genetics, right? I'm getting confused now because I switched with my other class. But that process it requires energy. You have to give energy in order to build something. And as the part that we always leave out of all these processes is what is making that process go? Like, why does the enzyme zip across? Well, as it's moving across, it's grabbing ATP molecules out of the cytoplasm, or the nucleoplasm in that case. It's in the nucleus, but the ATP molecules are everywhere. And it's retrieving energy from those ATP molecules. So what it does in that process, and just to give you a quick overview of the biochemistry of this, and by the way, you don't need to know the shapes of these, not for this course anyway. I'm giving you sort of a preview of grade 12. In grade 12, you talk a lot more about the biochemistry and the actual shapes of these molecules and how they chemically bond to each other and stuff like that. That's the biochemistry component that you really dig into in grade 12. This is in grade 11. This is much more of an overview. But an ATP stands for adenosine. So the adenosine component is right here. It's an adenine, and hopefully you recognize adenine. It is one of the 4 nitrogenous bases that you find in DNA. Same molecule. Okay, so a lot of this stuff is conserved from one system to the other in cells. There's sort of like a basic set of molecules, and they're reused for different functions. So there's adenine again. It's one of the nitrogenous bases from DNA. So you got an adenine. You've got a ribose sugar, which is, you got a ribose sugar, which again should look familiar. It is the part of the sugar backbone in RNA, right? Ribonucleic acid, RNA. So the ribose is the same, it's the same sugar, ribose sugar. And then attached to that are 3 phosphate molecules, which hopefully you remember from grade 10 chemistry. So phosphate is PO4 minus, PO4 3 minus, PO4 3 minus. And it's a polyatomic ion. You would have learned this in grade 10 chemistry. And there are 3 of them linked together in an ATP. That's why it's adenosine triphosphate. So the tri just means 3. And that's how it stores its energy, is actually this last bond between this phosphate and the last phosphate. So that chemical bond in there is where all of the energy is stored. So what you have in the cell is ADP. So ADP is adenosine diphosphate with 2 phosphates on it. And then when you want to store some energy, what you do is you just pop that last phosphate onto the end of it. And in popping that phosphate on, you are putting some energy storage into the ATP molecule. Then it becomes ATP. So ATP is the energy storage. Then when ATP gets used up, so let's say that enzyme that's building RNA, as it's zipping across, it's grabbing ATPs and it's breaking off this last phosphate group as it does that. And as it pulls the last phosphate group on, it gains a little bit of energy every time it pulls that phosphate group off. So we're basically just talking about transferring energy from one molecule to another. That's how it works in biochemistry. It's an energy transfer. So it all comes down to ATP. ATP is that magical molecule that is holding the energy for virtually every biochemical reaction inside of your cell. And so it's needed for everything. So I like to think about it sort of like a bunch of sinks. Okay? If you can imagine, all of your cell processes are kind of like a water wheel. And that water wheel needs something to turn it, okay, in order to do work. So you can think of the water wheel as being building RNA, mitosis, building proteins. All the different things that the cell is doing require energy, contracting your muscles, all that thing. That's the water wheel, okay? It's all of the different cellular processes, and they need something to push them, to make them go. And that thing that is making them go is the ATP. So ATP is running across the water wheel and turning it. And as it turns the water wheel, it becomes ADP. Okay? So ATP converts to ADP and it makes all of your cellular processes go. Well, you have to have a way to replenish this top sink of ATP, the higher energy molecule, so that you can keep all of the cellular processes running. And so what you need is a pump, something to move the resources from ADP, which is low energy, all the way back up to ATP at the top here again. So we need something to pump from down here and then all the way back up here to ATP again. And the pump, the thing that rebuilds that storage at the top, that top sink, is cellular respiration. That's the process that does that continuously refills that ATP pool at the top. And cellular respiration is this chemical reaction right here. It's using oxygen and combining it with sugar or fat, and then that pumps ADP up into ATP storage. Now, so what you guys saw in the video was that we removed one of the important components of this. If you remove the oxygen component from that, well, you slow the pump down, or you stop the pump if you completely remove it, but you slow the pump down. And so what was happening in this guy's brain is that the upper ATP storage here is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and all of his neurons, which need that ATP in order to function, well, the water wheel is turning slower and slower and stopping turning. And then when that happens, the neurons stop firing and they stop functioning properly, and you get whatever happened to him there, loss of cognitive function. So I find that so fascinating. So in his case, they didn't completely remove the oxygen. So it wasn't a complete turning off of this pump. I hope this is a good metaphor, by the way. Hopefully this makes sense what I'm saying here. They didn't completely turn off the pump. They didn't completely turn off the cellular respiration pump. They just turned it way down. So what it did was it just slowed the water wheel down significantly until he was, not really functioning very well. But if you completely remove the oxygen input here to cellular respiration, then you halt cellular respiration. And we're going to talk about some ways in which that can happen. But I mean, if your heart stops beating, that's what's happening. You are stopping pumping oxygen to your cells. If you are in an environment where there is no oxygen remaining, underwater, space, you are also stopping the pump from functioning if you find yourself in that environment, because you're not inputting any oxygen to the system. And so when those types of situations happen, when you are not breathing or in an environment where there's no oxygen, or your heart stops pumping, or for some reason your blood can't transport oxygen, those are all different links in the chain that move oxygen around, you're going to turn this pump off, and eventually you're going to die. Now, it doesn't take very long for you to lose consciousness, because one of the most sensitive cells in your body to low oxygen are your neurons in your brain. You really only get maybe a couple seconds of useful consciousness once you have removed oxygen input. It's very, very brief period. Now keep in mind that if you're holding your breath or something like that, you are not completely removing your oxygen input. You still have some oxygen in your lungs, and so it is going across the membrane into your blood, and there's still some being pumped around for a while after you start holding your breath, quite a while. But if you remove all the oxygen from your lungs, you basically suck it out like you're in an airplane that's been depressurized and you're at a really high altitude, like 35,000 feet. At that point, you really only have a couple seconds of consciousness, maybe 5 seconds of useful consciousness, 10 at the most, and then you're going to be unconscious. Your neurons simply are not going to be able to maintain your consciousness anymore at that point. I find it fascinating that it's that fast. So neurons are very sensitive to low oxygen. When you turn their pump off, they're done pretty much right away. However, there are other types of tissue in your body that are actually very resistant. I wanted to mention, by the way, that the size of this pump, how quickly you can convert ADP to ATP, and how quickly you can use oxygen is what it is what's known as your Vo2 max. It's your volume of oxygen, your maximum volume of oxygen that you can use. And this is a statistic that you can measure in somebody. What's the maximum amount of oxygen that they can use? Because what you're measuring is cellular respiration. And it's a very good indicator of athletic performance, because when you are running, it's basically telling you what the highest intensity is that you can run at continuously. Because as long as you are refilling the ATP storage at the top, you can just keep going. You can just keep running, not infinitely. I mean, there are going to be other factors that are going to get in the way eventually. But as long as you are within your capacity to refill that ATP, you can keep up that work rate, whatever that work rate is. And so the higher your VO2 max, the higher the work rate that you can work for an extended period. That's sort of like the basics of that. There's some other interfering factors there as well, but it's an excellent measurement of athletic performance. So if you become a university athlete, or maybe even right now you are an athlete in something semi-professional, or you belong to, you're a club runner or something, you may have already had your VO2 max measured. Again, because it's an excellent indicator of your athletic performance, and you can use it as sort of to create training goals for yourself. When you improve through athletic practice, through working out, you are increasing the size of this pump. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can increase the size of the pump. You can increase the amount of oxygen you can transport in your blood by increasing your number of red blood cells or your blood volume, or you can increase how hard your heart can pump, or you can increase the musculature in your heart, or you can increase the number of capillaries, small blood vessels that are wrapped around your muscles. You can increase how much those blood vessels are wrapped around your muscles. You can increase the number of mitochondria in your cells, specifically in muscle. So all of those things would serve to increase the size of this pump, and that's what happens when you're working out, basically, from a endurance perspective. Now, increasing muscle mass and stuff like that is a different type of working out. Resistance training is a different type of working out, and it does modify these factors a little bit, but it's not so much specific to Vo2 Max. But any endurance training would be something where you're increasing the size of this pump significantly. So I just wanted to talk about some actual values for Vo2 Max, some sizes of this pump, depending on, and maybe you've had this measured previously, but just so you have some numbers for comparison. Vo2 Max is usually measured in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute of time. Okay, so it's milliliters per kilogram per minute. And so this is affected by your total body mass, which means that age is kind of an important factor here as well. So for children, these are not great measurements because they have very small body masses, and so they tend to have extremely high Vo2 maxes. Babies have extremely high Vo2 maxes because their oxygen transport is relatively good as a baby. I mean, you're born fit, for lack of a better word. You're born fairly fit as a baby. Your oxygen transport is pretty good, but your body mass is very, very small. And so then, just because of the math here, you're going to end up with a really high Vo2 max for a baby. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're an elite cyclist, but they tend to have very high Vo2 max values, which unfortunately progressively tend to go down as people get older. Now, they don't have to. You can have extremely high Vo2 max levels when you're in your 80s. It's just unlikely because people, especially in our culture, people tend to have less and less and less physical activity as they get older. And your body does the opposite. It detrains. So the size of this pump gets smaller when you're a couch potato, basically. You can make the pump extremely small by just being physically inactive. So anyway, so what are some values that are normal? Well, if you have less than 20 milliliters per kilogram per minute, it means that you're going to struggle to go up a flight of stairs. If you go up a flight of stairs, you won't be able to maintain for any length of time the amount of oxygen necessary to produce the energy to just climb a staircase, even at a normal pace of going up a staircase. And so that's generally considered to be an illness category if you have less than 20 milliliters per kilogram per minute. There are pulmonary illnesses that cause Vo2 maxes that are this low. But anyway, it's rare. So I would say it's probably very unlikely that anyone your age has a Vo2 anywhere near that low. For somebody who's like 16, the average is probably somewhere around 35 or 40 milliliters per kilogram per minute. That would be for if you're athletic. If you are regularly taking part in physical activity, it's probably closer to 45 or 50. 50 would probably be normal for a normal active teenager. Same thing for adults, by the way. If you're regularly active 4 or 5 days a week, you get minimum half hour of intense physical exercise. Your Vo2 max is probably sitting around 45 or 50. A sedentary person is somewhere around 35, which is quite low, actually. But if you are training, let's say that you're on the cross-country team, you're running every day, or maybe every second day, and you're actively working to increase your Vo2 max, you might have a Vo2 max somewhere in the mid-60s. 65 is probably not unheard of for a high school athlete. If you're an elite athlete at the high school level, like maybe you are one of the better 800-meter runners in Ontario, then you probably have a VO2 max somewhere in the low to mid 70s, 72, 73. That wouldn't be unlikely for somebody who was an elite runner. I put 80 there, 80 mils per kilogram per minute, because that's like Tour de France winning. I don't want to call it a maximum. There was really no maximum, but 80 mils per kilogram per minute is like that's like the VO2 max of the winner of the Tour de France. Not even just like someone competing, but like the elite. That's a very, very high value for VO2 max. So anyway, you can, like I said, you can get this measured. We could go over a procedure to do a predictive measurement of VO2 max, which is basically you go out and do some exercises, you time yourself, and then you can use a formula to predict what your VO2 max is based on that. But I mean, if you're interested, let me know. We can talk about that stuff. But there is a little bit of error potential there with those predictive tests. The only way to really accurately measure it is to get in the lab and do a Vo2 max test. And they do it by actually measuring how much oxygen you're using with an oxygen sensor. So they look at how much oxygen is going in, that's atmospheric oxygen. They look at how much oxygen is coming out, and then they just figure out the difference. So, and then they make you exercise at higher and higher intensities until they basically see a plateau where you can no longer retrieve any more oxygen from the air that you're breathing in. That's the basics of how it works. And then at that point, they know that that's your maximum ability to do cellular respiration at that point, which is kind of cool. Anyway, you can have this done. By the way, there are places in KW that will do testing for you, and universities do this. They all have their own facilities for doing this, but it's usually for testing athletes because they want to use it as a benchmark to see how their training is going. So, if you're an endurance athlete. So you might be wondering then, how do you actually get the oxygen in? Sorry, 1 second, guys. Oh, that's exciting. Construction value 40,000, eh? Let's hope. Sorry about that. God, all kinds of things happening. Crying babies and... Anyway. You might be wondering, how does the gas actually get in? Why does the gas go in? Just because you put oxygen into your lungs, like, why does it go into your body? Like, what forces it to go in? And my first thought, and I don't know if this is your first thought, but my first thought is that there's something pumping it in. Like, maybe in your lungs you have something in the cells that are just forcing oxygen to go into, like some kind of pressure forcing them in. And I wouldn't fault you for thinking that. That does make a lot of sense, except for the fact that the amount of energy that would take would be totally prohibitive. You wouldn't be able to do this if it required energy. So we're going to do a quick little review here of the idea of diffusion. We've talked about diffusion previously, but the basics of that, the basics of diffusion, the principle of diffusion, is that gases, and this works for liquids as well, always move from high concentration to low concentration. It's as simple as that. If you see an area somewhere of high concentration of anything, it's going to move to an area of low concentration if it's able to. If you prevent it from moving, you have a membrane that doesn't allow any movement, or you contain it somehow, well, then it won't move. But if you don't contain it, it is going to move. You're always going to get movement from high concentration to low concentration. And the principle of diffusion is based on the idea of entropy, which, do you guys talk about entropy in grade 11 chemistry, for those of you that have taken it? Talk about the laws of thermodynamics. It's actually, I think it's something you learn in physics too. And I don't know about in grade 11 physics, maybe grade 12 physics. The laws of thermodynamics. Anybody? Anybody? No, you didn't. Okay. Well, fair enough. Then maybe that's for grade 12 then. But let me pull up a little demonstration so I can show you what I mean here. What's the name of that physics thing? PhysPhet. There it is. You guys might have used these simulations in physics before. Okay, I'm going to start with a very simple premise. Okay? There are a bunch of particles in a room, and the room has a divider in the center preventing them from, interacting with the other side of the room. Okay, this is a two-dimensional model, but this works in 3 dimensions as well. And I'll include the center of mass so you can see where that is. All that center of mass indicator is just showing you where the center is of all of the masses of the particles. If you average them out, that's where the middle is of the mass of those particles. So I think it's fairly clear what would happen if I removed this barrier. And keep in mind that this is just a simulation. All it's doing is the particles are following their own physical laws, just like particles do in real life. They just bounce into each other and follow the physical laws. There's no magic happening here, and it's not faking anything. This is just a simulation. So what do you think would happen in this case if I removed the barrier in the center? I'll give you a sec. All right, Logan, I mean, I agree with you. I feel like it's fairly straightforward here to assume that they're going to spread out, right? And so I can do that. I can remove the divider. And then when you do that, well, look at that. They do in fact spread into the other room. And I think you guys like intrinsically know this, that if there was a room and there was no gas on one side of the room, it was a vacuum, and you had gas on the other, and then you remove the barrier between the two sides, well, the vacuum is going to pull the particles into it. They're going to end up balanced between the two locations. I feel like that's obvious. Like people would see this and say, yeah, of course. Okay, I'm going to give you a situation that's a little bit less obvious, okay? Let's put the divider back. But now I'm going to add in the same number of particles on each side, okay? So these are different gases. Now, there's a little bit of like math fiddly-diddly going on here where I've made them the same mass, the particles. You can play around with this stuff, and it does affect the rate at which things are going to move around, but the overall outcome of it is going to be the same. So here, the only thing I've changed now is that I put the same number of particles on the other side of the room, but they're different particles. What do you think will happen in this case? This is far less obvious to me. Everybody's hesitant to volunteer any information here. Or the room is empty. Is it Logan? Is it just you and me? Let me look. Nope. It says that there's 26 people in here. No one wants to say. Anyone want to go out on a limb? All right. So, Mom, and I think this is a good guess. And let's just do it. Let's just do it and see what happens. Okay, as you're watching this, it's a little bit difficult to see what's going on, but if you watch the center of mass indicators, they're going to tell you where basically the middle of those particles are for the red and the blue ones. And again, keep in mind that all these particles are doing is just bumping into each other. There's no pressure making them do anything here. That they're just bumping into each other as they naturally would. Okay, so what you may be noticing is that, Mom, you were in fact correct. Over time, these particles are going to start to spread evenly over the total area that they are allowed to move into. Okay, that process is called diffusion. Essentially, the particles have gone from being a high concentration to being an even concentration everywhere. And another thing you might have noticed is that at the very beginning, when we first removed the barrier, the movement of the particles was very fast at the beginning. The movement towards the center was very quick when there was a big difference in concentration between the two sides. But as they get closer together, as the concentrations become more even on both sides, the transition becomes slower and slower. In other words, you can kind of think of it as there being more force at the beginning, moving the particles towards balance. And then as they're balancing out, there's less and less force compelling them to do that. It's not really a force per se, but that's like a way of thinking of it. Okay, so this is really important. What this means is if you have one gas on the side of a membrane, and for like oxygen, and you want it to be on the other side of the membrane, all you have to do is make sure that there's a difference in concentration from one side of the membrane to the other side of the membrane. If there's a difference in concentration, then the gas is always going to flow from high concentration to low concentration. That's the principle of diffusion. So your entire respiratory system is based on this idea. How do we get oxygen to go into the respiratory system? Well, first, make sure that there's oxygen on one side. That's why you breathe, okay? You got to breathe to make sure that there's oxygen on one side of the membrane. And then what do you have to do on the other side of the membrane? Well, you have to remove the oxygen that's on the other side. And if you do that, then you're always going to have movement from one side to the other side, because there's going to be oxygen on one side, or more oxygen on one side, and less oxygen on the other. So you've always got a constant stream of oxygen moving in. And just like in the lungs, there actually is a molecule on the other side of the membrane, in this case in the blood, that we want to have come out of the blood and go into the lungs. That's the gas that we're trying to get rid of. That's carbon dioxide. And so in that case, we want to do the exact opposite. We want to remove the carbon dioxide from the outside part, the lung part, which is why we breathe, to remove the carbon dioxide. And we want to increase the amount of carbon dioxide on the blood side, on the other part. And we do that by transporting the CO2 there through the blood. So I'm going to show you what this looks like now. But any questions about this idea of diffusion in general? Like, you've just seen it in action. This is how it works. Let me know if any part of that didn't make sense. So we're gonna talk about the actual anatomy of the lungs in a second, but whoops. Increase the size of my eraser here. If you can imagine, if you look way down deep into your lungs, there are these little sacs called alveoli. Okay, that's this little sac right here. They are, if you follow the lungs, if you go all the way deep into your lungs, each one of the little passageways terminates in a little sac, or a group of little sacs called alveoli. Okay, so you can think of this as just being the inside of the lungs, what the inside of the lungs looks like. It's thousands, hundreds of thousands of little sacs. And those sacs all have blood vessels that run along the outside of the alveoli. And this is where the actual gas exchange happens. The alveoli is very thin. It's only one cell thick. And the capillaries, which are those little tiny blood vessels, are also only one cell thick. And they're that thin because that means that gases can just move in and out of those vessels very easily. So what we want is to move O2 from the alveoli into the blood. We want to pump oxygen into the blood so that we can transport it around, right? And we want to do the exact opposite with CO2. We want to pump the CO2 out of the blood and into the alveoli so that we can remove it, right? But we're not pumping it, because pumping it would take way too much energy. So the way that we do this is we make sure that there is a high concentration. Oh, I should have done this in a different color. Orange is hard to see. By the way, the square brackets mean concentration of. I'll just note that off to the side here. So if there is a high concentration of oxygen in the alveoli, well, then the reason it's going into the blood is because we have a low concentration of O2 in the blood. And so you're going to have O2 moving from the alveoli into the capillary, just because of that concentration gradient, that difference in concentration between the two. It's always going to go from high concentration to low concentration. If you stop breathing, well, the O2 in the alveoli here is going to start going lower and lower and lower until it's equal to the O2 that's already in the blood. And once it's equal to the O2 in the blood, then it's going to stop transporting oxygen excuse me, into the blood, which is why you need to keep breathing. So if you stop breathing, basically you're going to use up all the O2 that's in your alveoli, and then you're no longer going to be able to transport oxygen in your blood. The same thing is true for CO2. So we want to remove the CO2 from the blood. We want to go in the opposite direction for CO2. So what is in the blood is high CO2 concentration. And what's in the alveoli, and what we need to maintain in the alveoli, is low CO2 concentration. Oy, oy, oy. There's like a huge amount of lag on this. Okay, I'm going to try and reset this again. Recently, I've been having so much trouble with that. I don't know what's going on with this software. There we go. Low CO2 concentration. And we keep it low in the lungs by continuously breathing. And so if you breathe, you're going to remove the CO2 from the alveoli, and then keep this concentration gradient up, this difference in concentration between the blood and the alveoli. And as long as we maintain that concentration gradient, that difference in concentration, then we can maintain this transport of oxygen in and this transport of CO2 out. As soon as we stop ventilating or breathing, then this process is going to break down. Now, this process can also be broken down if we stop pumping blood. Obviously, if we're not sending blood around anymore, this process is going to break down as well. So the heart is kind of important in this process as well. We're gonna cover that more on Monday, though. So anyway, I have this basically written out in brief here. There's a high concentration of O2 in your alveoli if you keep breathing, which I highly recommend, and a low concentration of O2 in the blood, because that blood is coming back from all of your body cells after they've used up the oxygen. So we have a system like that where when we send blood out from the heart to the body, it's full of oxygen, and then we have a separate system to collect the used blood, basically, the blood that has low oxygen, and return that back to the heart so it can pump it to the lungs. So that's like the dual circuit that happens in the heart, and we'll talk more about that on Monday. We're going to get into the circulatory system in a lot more detail, but essentially we keep the blood that has oxygen in it and the blood that doesn't have oxygen in it separate. We have like two separate systems. Arteries in general are carrying oxygenated blood, the fresh blood, and veins are carrying the other part. They're carrying the deoxygenated blood for the most part. There's one exception to that rule, but in general, that's how it works. So as long as you keep breathing, you maintain the concentration gradient, and this keeps operating. Now that's great for getting oxygen into your blood. However, you also need to get oxygen into your cells. And so what is happening at the cell level is the exact same thing. You've got blood passing by your cells through a capillary. So you have little tiny blood vessels that are running all around all of your cells. No cell in your body is more than 3 cells away from a capillary. So capillaries are running through basically everything. If you take a look at, I don't know if anybody's ever seen Body Worlds before. I don't know if I mentioned this in this class, I can't remember. But Body Worlds is like a display where they take humans, cadavers, and they make like art out of them. It's very fascinating. And they have this really cool one where they have plasticized all of the blood vessels in somebody's face. They turn them into plastic. And then they've used an acid to dissolve all the other tissue in the face, the skin, the fat, the muscle. So the only thing, the bone, the only thing that's left, or actually I think the bone is still there, but the only thing that's left behind is the blood vessels and the bone. Let me show you what it looks like. Just so you can see like actually the number of vessels that's running through tissue, because it's really crazy. face would probably be the right image. Yeah, there it is. There's the face one. So this is just the larger capillaries, or the larger sort of arterioles that are running through the face. You can't really see the capillaries because they're so fine and so tiny that they basically get destroyed in this process. So here we're not even looking at the finest, tiniest vessels. We're just looking at sort of like the arterioles that are leading to the capillaries. And even if you just look at those vessels, which are the slightly larger vessels than capillaries, there's so many. I mean, the amount of blood supply that you have going through your body it's thousands of kilometers of blood vessels. It's ludicrous how much there's actually running through here. So, cool, eh? Look at all those blood vessels. It's insane. But at the blood vessel level, remember that there's high oxygen in that blood because you're sending it basically from the lungs. It's stopping at the heart on the way, but it has just been pumped full of oxygen at the lungs. So it gets to the cell and it has a high concentration of O2. Well, the cell has a low concentration of O2 because it's using O2 up, doing cellular respiration. And so there's going to be a gradient, a difference in concentration, high O2 in the blood and low O2 in the cell. And so naturally, you're going to get oxygen diffusing into the cell. That's how it gets its oxygen. And going in the opposite direction, the blood that is going through the circulatory system here has low CO2 in it because you just removed it in the lungs. But in the cell, there's high CO2 because the cell is making CO2 as part of cellular respiration. So again, you have a concentration gradient. There's high CO2 in the cell and low CO2 in the blood vessel. And so you're going to get this movement, this diffusion of CO2 into the blood, which allows you to transport it back to the lungs to get rid of it. And so this is a continuous cycle. The blood fills up with CO2 and drops off its O2. It goes back to the lungs to pick up more O2 and get rid of the CO2. Then it goes back to the cell to drop off the O2 and pick up CO2. And then it goes back to the lungs. And so this is a continuous cycle. It happens over and over again. So that's the basics of the process. I want to talk a little bit now about, does anybody have any questions? We're going to go on and talk about the anatomy here, the actual pieces of the respiratory system, which you probably covered in grade 10, but this might be a review. But any questions about sort of that idea of transport of gases? If I hear anything, I always circle back. So let me know if anything crosses your mind. Okay, so what do you need? What structures have to be present then in a respiratory system? So I'll mention that these respiratory systems are common in most animals, not cnidarians, not porifera, which are sea sponges, but pretty much every other animal has some form of respiratory system. I'm overgeneralizing a touch, but certainly all the vertebrates do. Vertebrates all have a complex respiratory system that's very similar to ours. Birds, lizards, mammals, etc. Or I should say amphibians and reptiles, fish. They all have sort of a similar system, and they all require these basic 4 things in order to get things to function properly. I mean, like I said, and I mentioned this already, in this course, I'm mostly focusing on the human piece. We're just kind of referencing things from other areas in the animal kingdom, and sometimes in kingdoms outside of the animal kingdom. But for the most part, I'm going to focus on human anatomy here. But the same sort of principles apply to all animals. I shouldn't say all animals, all vertebrates anyway. So First of all, you need a thin membrane for gas exchange. So you have to make sure that at that interface where you go from the environment, which would be in the alveoli, to the blood, that has to be a very, very thin barrier. And the reason it has to be so thin is to allow diffusion to occur. If you have a really thick barrier, it's going to prevent those two gases from moving across the barrier. Basically, there's just too much stuff in the way. So you have to have a very thin membrane. That's one of the reasons why, by the way, why your lungs are so fragile. They really are quite fragile because the membranes on the alveoli are tiny, teeny, teeny, tiny membranes, and they can be damaged quite easily. So when I'm talking about thin membranes, I'm talking about the alveolar tissue is very thin, and the capillary tissue, which is on the other side, is very thin. It's only 1 cell thick. It's basically as thin as you can make a tissue in your body. If you had alveolar tissue that was just exposed on the surface of your body and you touched it with a finger, you would probably severely damage it. It would probably be you would have inflammation just from mild contact. I should also mention that thin membrane that you have in your lungs, you have to keep it moist. There has to be water on the membrane, and that the water is actually to allow the gases to dissolve into the water, and so that they can more easily pass into the blood. So it has to be kept moist in there too. And we'll talk a little bit about moisturizing the system in a second, because you have some sort of systems built in to moisturize the air, but it's to keep that thin membrane wet. If you can imagine, in the winter, your skin gets dried out sometimes, right? Well, that's not a huge deal. You've got a layer of dead skin on top of your epidermal layer that is protecting it, and even if it cracks, I mean, it's not that problematic. It's quite thick, but in your alveolar tissue, it's only 1 cell thick. So if it ever dries out, or if it gets cracky or whatever, I mean, it's going to bleed. There's a blood vessel directly on the other side. So anyway, you have to be much more careful preserving the balance, the humidity, and everything inside of your lungs. You also need a large surface area. So in order to actually get enough gas exchange to happen, in order to support all those different cells of your body, you need a really, really large surface to pass the gas across. So one way we do that is that the shape of the alveoli, which is where the gas exchange is happening, are spherical. And spheres have the highest surface area to volume ratio. They have lots and lots of surface area, and surface area is where the exchange of gas happens, at the surface. So, I mean, we've just naturally evolved for them to be spherical. And they're spherical on every gas exchange membrane in every animal that I'm aware of that has gas exchange, because they just naturally evolve into that shape. It is the most efficient for gas transport. And the other component of that is that we have many thousands of the alveoli. In order to actually have enough oxygen passing into your blood, you got to have a heck of a lot of alveoli. And so you do. You have hundreds of thousands of alveoli, which is pretty cool. Other organisms don't have quite as efficient a gas transport mechanism. I'll give you a great example. Insects have the same sort of spherical gas exchange membranes, but those membranes are distributed. Usually they're holes in their carapace, which is sort of a part of their exoskeleton. So they have holes in their exoskeleton that allow gas exchange to happen with the tissues that are underneath. And there's usually a liquid that's sort of flowing on the inside, pseudolymph, or something akin to blood that is kind of running over on the inside of their exoskeleton. So because insects have that, they have that exoskeleton, and they don't have lungs, they really don't have the ability to transport very much oxygen. And that's the reason why insects only get to a certain size. You're not gonna go out and see like an insect the size of a car, or like an insect the size of a a bicycle, you know, like a large insect. And the reason for that is that they just don't have the capacity to take in enough oxygen to support all of their cells if they were to be that large. There just isn't enough surface area for that gas transport. They don't have lungs. So there really is a hard limit on how big insects can evolve to be. They can't really be much bigger than they are right now. The largest ones that you see are pretty much the largest ones that can exist. Now, you may have heard that historically, if you go back to Triassic period or 60, 70 million years ago, you may have heard that there were insects at that time that were the size of bicycles, that were 6 feet long, 7 feet long, giant. What's the word I'm looking for? Not mayfly, dragonflies. Something would be the ancient ancestor of dragonflies, flying around that were 6 feet long, and that's true. We did have that 60, 70 million years ago, and the reason that they could exist 60 or 70 million years ago is because the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere was much higher than it is now. Right now, the atmosphere is about 20% oxygen, but I think in the Triassic, I think it's like 30 or 40% oxygen. Hold on, let me look that up. Actually, I'm not sure what the actual amount is. %30 in the Permian. Yeah. Oh, Triassic is later. So there was actually less oxygen during the Triassic. During the Permian, though, it was 30%. Interesting. So 30% is a lot higher. It's a third more oxygen in the atmosphere, and therefore they didn't require as much surface area in order to transport oxygen, because there was just a higher force pushing oxygen into their respiratory system, into their circulation. So you could have these giant insects. That's kind of cool. So anyway, thin membranes, large surface area. You need a blood supply. So you need a liquid on the other side in order to capture the oxygen coming in and to transport the CO2 to be removed. And you need lots and lots of blood flow to occur. So if you were to actually zoom in on an alveoli, you would notice that it is absolutely covered in capillaries. There are many, many, many capillaries running throughout your lungs. It is extremely vascularized, and that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to operate on lungs, because when you cut this tissue, there is blood coming out everywhere. There are small blood vessels everywhere inside the lungs. So typically when you're removing lung tissue, let's say that you're removing a tumor or something in the lungs, you often have to remove an entire lobe of the lung. So the lungs are kind of separated into lobes, which are relatively separate from each other. So you're not usually just cutting straight into lung tissue because it's so vascularized. It's very difficult to stifle bleeding in that case, because you can imagine there's blood vessels everywhere. So, but you need that blood supply in order to get that gas exchange to happen. And then lastly, you need a way to ventilate. Ventilating is refreshing the air that is in your alveoli. So you need some system to do that, to get air in and out of that system. We have a diaphragm. We're going to talk about how we ventilate shortly. But different animals have different systems for this. Fish have a muscular gill system where they can kind of push water across their gills. Their gills basically are just like external alveoli. It's very similar to our alveolus system, except it's just basically inside out. It's an inside out version of the alveoli. And they blow water across using their gill system. So they also have a muscular system to pass water across the membrane. Birds have lungs. Let's see. Amphibians have lungs. Although some of them have some type of gill system as well. Sometimes they have hybrid respiratory systems. That's the amphibian part. They're able to, a lot of them are able to ventilate via water as well. Reptiles have lungs. I think I've covered most of the vertebrates anyway. But anyway, let's talk about the actual anatomy of the entire system from top to bottom. You do need to know these. This is from grade 10, so I don't think this is going to be any giant surprise to anybody what these parts are. But I am going to talk a little bit about, for each, some of these specific adaptations and functions of those parts that allow the system to be more functional. And remember that that's really what this animal systems unit and plant systems unit is about. It's about what is the anatomy and how is that anatomy serving the function of the system. So I'm going to kind of put a little bit of anatomy here together with why is it well suited to its function. So first of all, up at the top, you got a mouth and a nasal passage. Typically, humans are breathing through the nasal passage, although there are mouth breathers out there. You can breathe through your mouth. It's obviously a larger passage for moving larger volumes of air. Excuse me. But so it's used more during exercise when you need to ventilate significantly more. But at rest conditions, the nasal passage is usually preferred because it has hair on the inside and mucus. It's got some mucus on the inside and hair, which has a dual role. So the hairs are filters. They remove large particles of matter from the air that you're inhaling so that junk doesn't get stuck in your alveoli. You want to prevent junk from going in there so that it doesn't obstruct your respiration and your ventilation. So the filtration that happens in your nose is actually important. The mucus does that as well. So the mucus is sticky, and it is able to capture small particles that are maybe 5 micron, or well, certainly 10 micron wide. Smaller particles. Anything smaller than 5 micron, I think usually just passes right by your nasal hairs. It's too small to be captured by that or the mucus. If it's smaller than 2.5 microns, really small particulate matter, that stuff usually just goes right into your alveoli. So that stuff is the most dangerous type of matter that you can inhale because you're just very bad at filtering it out, and so it can accumulate in your lungs. Particles that are smaller than or at or smaller than 2.5 microns wide. So when we're talking about that type of pollution, you're not exposed to a ton of it, but it's in things like automotive pollution and stuff like that. If you live in a really built-up industrial area, you may be getting some PM 2.5 from industry, whatever. It's quite rare here. It's fairly well regulated in Canada, but there are places in the world where there's a lot more of that being produced. India and China are examples that come to mind that don't have the same regulation for small particulate matter. And so people just have higher exposure. I could look up the numbers, but there's a relationship between that and asthma, cancer, a whole bunch of different things. Because those particles are very difficult to be filtered out. But anyway, the hairs, I'm getting off track a bit here. The hairs and the mucus filter, and the secondary function of the mucus is that it moisturizes. So I mentioned that you got to keep the air in your lungs pretty moist, pretty wet, in order for you to just protect the inner surface of your alveoli, which need to be kept relatively moist in order to work properly. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that if you are climbing in very cold temperatures, or maybe you are trekking in the Arctic or the Antarctic, oftentimes you are wearing a respirator that is just simply an air warmer. You may have heard of these before. Often it's like tubing that runs over your back with a little valve system, and all it does is it allows you to warm the air a little bit that's coming in, which allows you to moisturize it. If it's coming in extremely cold, -40, -50, maybe in some circumstances, that air is going to be extremely dry, and it's going to be very problematic when you inhale it. It's super hard on your lungs. So there are like air warming systems that you can get. And many of them also are built to moisturize the air on the way in to make it a lot less hard on your lungs while you're breathing. Anyway, so that's the nasal passages in the mouth. Then you're going to pass through the back of the throat, which is obviously dual purpose here. It's for swallowing as well. So it's not specific to the respiratory system, but that's called the pharynx. Or if you're talking about the back of the throat and the sort of like upper throat area right here, it's often referred to as the oropharynx. The oropharynx is sort of like the back of the tongue and that area. Just the very, very top of the respiratory tract here, not including the mouth. Okay, so that's, or it's sometimes referred to as just the throat. I have a sore throat. That's your oropharynx. Right below that is this part, I guess you could say, is part of the digestive system and part of the respiratory system. It's kind of a hybrid, but it's a little flap of tissue called the epiglottis, which you would have heard about previously. And the function of that thing is, I think, fairly obvious. Every time you swallow, if you actually watch in the mirror when you swallow, like tilt your head up and watch it, you can actually see that your larynx slides up a little bit when you swallow. And when your larynx slides up, the larynx is where your, I guess you call your Adam's apple, the little bump is right here. That's your larynx right below there. So when this part slides up when you swallow, this little flap, the epiglottis, slides down. Okay, it's like a whoop, like this. And then the little flap, when the little flap gets pushed up, it goes up and then it tilts over and covers up the trachea. And you need that because when you swallow food and water and stuff like that, you don't want it to go into your larynx and into your trachea, into your respiratory system. So that's protective. Below that, the larynx or voice box is where your vocal cords are located, which again you'll see in the video if you care to watch the video. It shows how they work a little bit. They can be tightened or loosened depending on the muscles that you use in your voice box. So you can change the tone. So you can do. That's all based on how tightly you're stringing the chords in your vocal cords, how tightly you're pulling on them. If you're a singer, this is also where you get vocal nodes. So vocal nodes are basically scar tissue that's forming on your vocal cords if you are overusing them, over-exercising them. Can be fairly serious if you're a vocal artist. Anyway, proceeding downward, you've got this tube right here, and if you run your hand along it, you can probably feel that there are little bumps. Bump, 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 bump on the way down. Those little bumps are the cartilaginous rings that always hold open the tube. So unlike your esophagus, which is behind that, where the food goes down, the esophagus does not stay open all the time. It's not just like an open tube all the time. It kind of just flattens out and collapses when there's no food going down. But the trachea can't do that. You gotta leave that thing open all the time. And so those little rings of cartilage, they actually hold the tube open all the time so it doesn't collapse. It's pretty important that you keep it open. So anyway, the cartilaginous tubes keep that open. That's the trachea, otherwise known as the windpipe. And as you proceed downward, there is a place where it splits, and that's right for you guys. If you look where your armpit is, okay, and then just draw a line across your chest from armpit to armpit, that's right at the level of your bronchi, if you're wondering where it is in your chest. Okay, so the bronchi are right there at armpit level, and the bronchi is just the name of the split. Okay, it's when the one pipe goes into two. Okay, you technically have two bronchi, left bronchi and a right bronchi, one going into each lung, and then the bronchi start splitting into smaller and smaller vessels. So you'll get a smaller vessel here. These are the bronchioles, by the way. So bronchioles split into smaller bronchioles, which split into smaller bronchioles, which split into smaller bronchioles. And they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until they get to the smallest size of bronchiole. And then that branches out into alveolar sacs at the end. So you have these little sacs, And then that's where all of the blood vessels are running on the outside of those sacs for gas exchange. When I was a kid, well, actually when I was in high school, I assumed that the inside of the lungs were like a balloon. I mean, obviously I had no idea how much surface area was in there until I took this course. And I always wondered, like, when people got pneumonia, and when they got liquid in their lungs, why don't they just vacuum it out? Like, it makes sense in your mind, like, to just say, well, just put a tube in there, just like suck all the liquid out, right? If somebody has pneumonia, it seems so obvious. And the reason for that is that the tubes are extremely tiny, because these bifurcate and bifurcate and bifurcate into teeny, teeny, tiny little tubes. And then at the very end of those teeny little tiny tubes, there are these very, very tiny, almost microscopic sacs at the end. And so that is impossible to do in real life. You can't vacuum out 100,000 tiny little microscopic sacs. So that's. But I didn't realize that. I didn't know that when I was in high school. But anyway, there it is. There's the basics. They are sitting in a cavity inside of your chest called the pleural cavity, and it has a membrane running around on the outside. That's this membrane right here, over top of it, called the pleural membrane, which is very soft, smooth, and a little bit gooey on the inside. And that's just to keep the friction down between your chest and your lungs, because remember, your chest is increasing in size and decreasing in size and increasing, and it would be rubbing and rubbing and rubbing against your lungs. And so you kind of have to put it in this like soft, lubricated sac inside so that you don't damage it from constantly rubbing it against stuff. And there's a little muscle at the bottom. We're going to talk about its function in a minute, but that little muscle at the bottom is called the diaphragm. So, quick review here about the function. Oh, I neglected to mention some of these things. I'm gonna mention them now. So we talked about the nasal passage having mucous membranes and hairs. Remember that those are to filter large particles. And, I forgot about the second part. I should write that in. And moisturize air. The epiglottis is there to prevent food from entering the larynx. Don't want that. The trachea and the bronchi and bronchioles have a really interesting characteristic. If you zoom way in and you look at that tissue under the microscope, actually, I can show you that image. I wonder if this will just bring me an electron micrograph. Or I might have to look it up. Oh, here we go. There we go. There's a picture of this even under a light microscope. You don't even need an electron micrograph. So this is a slide of the epithelial tissue on the inside of your trachea or bronchioles. Okay, and if you look at it, you'll notice that they look hairy, which is strange. Those hairs are called cilia. And this type of epithelial lining is called ciliated epithelium because there's cilia on it. And those hairs have a really cool function in that they actually sweep particulate matter up and out of your respiratory system. They're constantly sweeping stuff upward. So they actually pass things along. Little particles of matter get passed along those little hairs, and they move them back up, back past the larynx, up until they get to a spot in your pharynx where you can swallow them. So they get pushed back out of the respiratory system into an area where you're able to swallow them down. And obviously, I mean, that is an essential function. It is basically the vacuum cleaning system of the respiratory system. So what happens when you inhale stuff into your respiratory system and you can't cough it up? Like, it's too small to cough up. That's a fair amount of stuff. Well, this ciliated epithelium takes care of the rest of that for you. It moves those particles up back into the oropharynx or into the pharynx, which allows you to swallow them. I think that's so fascinating. You have like a little vacuum cleaning system in there. Now, there is one important thing to note about this ciliated epithelium, and that is it does not extend into your alveoli. Remember that the alveoli have to be very, very thin in order for gas exchange to happen. So you can't put these hairs on the surface of them. It would prevent gas exchange from happening effectively. So once particulate matter gets down into your alveoli, you can perhaps cough it out, maybe. But if the matter is small enough, like it's less than 2.5 microns, or it has an unusual shape like asbestos, we're going to talk about asbestos later, if it's able to get down into the alveolar tissue, there's actually no way to remove it. And so some certain types of pollution have a tendency to really stay in the alveolar tissue for a long time. What's a great way to expose yourself to a ton of particulate matter that is less than 2.5 microns? Smoking. There's one thing that is a great way to expose your lungs to a ton of small particulate matter. Also, when you smoke, you paralyze your ciliated epithelium and make it much more difficult to remove particulate matter from your respiratory system, which is one of the reasons why smokers get a lot more respiratory illnesses than non-smokers. We'll talk about smoking a little bit more later when we talk about illnesses of the respiratory system, but if there's one thing that you take away from this study of the respiratory system, let it be that the worst thing that you could do to your respiratory system is to smoke. I'm sure there are smokers in this class. There always are. You really think about it. Really think about the damage that you're doing to your respiratory system. Everybody always says, especially teenagers, no offense, guys, I was in your shoes not that long ago, and so I remember being a teenager. You feel like it's something that you're going to do right now. It's not going to be permanent. And what's the big deal? People smoke for a bunch of years and then they quit all the time. This is true. However, quitting smoking is a lot more difficult than you might imagine. I have a feeling people really don't know how difficult it is to quit smoking. I've never had to do it myself, but certainly I know many people who have tried to quit smoking and have had a tremendous difficulty quitting. My father would be one of them, who has never been able to quit smoking despite trying many times over his life. And it has been devastating for his health. But this applies to lots of people that I know, people my age. I'm in my early 30s. I don't think I'm that old. But I certainly have many colleagues that started smoking when they were teenagers and they just have not been able to quit. We can talk about vaping and stuff later. Vaping is kind of a little bit of a different story, and maybe people are interested in when we get into the illnesses part. If people have questions about that, we can talk a little bit about evidence-based stuff regarding vaping and stuff too. But my strong recommendation is don't start smoking. You're setting yourself up for a lot of difficulty. Anyway, the trachea has some cartilaginous rings, ciliated epithelium, which we just mentioned is sort of like a cleaning system, and it also has mucus on the inside for picking up particulate matter and moisturizing. The bronchi and bronchioles also have that ciliated epithelium and mucous membranes, and the alveoli, their main structural feature is that they are very thin. 1 cell thick, spherical for maximum surface area to volume ratio, and they are highly vascularized, which just means that they have lots of blood vessels associated with them. Lots and lots of blood supply for max gas exchange. How am I doing for time? 10 minutes. Can I do this last part in 10 minutes? I'm going to start it. I think I can do it. Am I going too fast? You guys okay? I'm going to pause right here just for a second and ask, is there anything that we've covered so far that you'd like me to go back and review? Or do you have a question about any of the anatomy, structure, diffusion, anything that we've covered so far where you're like, I'm not 100% sure on this particular thing. I know I'm asking you to kind of be brave, be bold here, and put something in the comments. But keep in mind that if you have a question, almost certainly other people have the same question. They just are afraid to ask. Or maybe you're just like, I'm interested in blank. And I was wondering if you knew anything about blank. I mean, and the answer might be no. I might have to look it up. But if you're interested in anything that we've mentioned so far. No comment. Okay. That's fine. I'll keep going then. Again, if anything pops into the chat, I'll circle back. Okay. Let's talk about how you inhale. So even before we get to any of this, before we even talk about anything, I want you to breathe in. Okay? Breathe in. And while you're breathing in, I want you to sort of reflect, think, kind of go inside your body here a little bit, and think about what you are physically doing to make yourself breathe in. Okay? I'll let you try it right now. Take a nice deep breath. What are you actually doing that is making you breathe? Okay, this is a voluntary breath. So now we're activating the breathing mechanism here on a conscious level. All right? I'm going to do it too. Oh, is it? That's a shame, Bree. Huh. I wonder if I'm streaming it maybe like too low. It's fixed now? Okay. All right, cool. If you ever see anything like that, please let me know. I might be able to change something on my end. I have really good internet here. So, like very, very fast up and down speed. So I should be able to like put out a really high quality stream. I am hoping it should be 1080p, but I have a feeling it's not 1080p. I got to play around with the settings maybe a little bit. But if you ever notice anything like that, please let me know. So, yeah, you've taken a breath. What did you do? Anyone want to throw that out there? What did you do in order to make air go in? Maybe you have to take a couple breaths to think about it. That's good, Ryan. Mohammed. I might be able to increase my bite rate on my end too. What'd you do? Where do you feel yourself breathing? How do you feel yourself breathing? What are you doing? I will say that you guys are a lot quieter than my other section. My other section, everybody's always saying something. This is sort of like you guys are much more reflective, pensive. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's just from my end, it's very quiet. I hardly hear anything from anybody in this class. No one wants to take a stab at it? What are you doing? No one wants to say. All right. That's fine. No one wants to volunteer anything here. Okay. chest movement is involved. True. So, interesting thought, Aaron. You feel your diaphragm pushing out. It does feel like you are pushing something out. The pushing out feeling that you're feeling is an increase in pressure in your abdomen. So you're right, there is an increase of abdominal pressure. You're right about that, Mohammed. You do pull in a little bit of additional air when you're consciously breathing. We're getting a little bit away from what I'm trying to get at here. But Aaron, you are 100% on the right track here. You feel an increase in pressure pushing out, and the reason for that is because when you're contracting your diaphragm, it's actually pulling down on your lungs, pulling down here, and pushing down on the stuff that is in your abdominal cavity. And so that increases the pressure on your abdominal side. That's the pushing out feeling that you feel. So you're right, there is a push out that occurs here. But the diaphragm doesn't really push your lungs. It's creating an empty space basically right here underneath your lungs. And because it's a vacuum in there, there's no air located in that space. It's actually dragging your lungs down. So as it's pulling down, what it's actually doing is creating low pressure inside of your lungs. It's basically like taking a balloon and pulling outward in every direction on the balloon. This is not usually how you inflate a balloon. But what you're doing by pulling down on your diaphragm is you're actually pulling outwards on the tissue of the balloon. You're pulling outward on your lungs, which creates a low pressure inside of the lungs. Because the pressure outside of the body is relatively higher than that, related to the pressure inside the lungs, now you have a pressure differential where you have higher pressure outside and lower pressure inside the lungs. And principle of diffusion, we just talked about this. Gases always travel from high pressure to low pressure. And so this is going to force air to take that pathway down the trachea and into the lungs. Okay? So it's going to create this negative pressure or low pressure inside the lungs, which is going to force air to go inside of the lungs. And you'll notice here that the lungs themselves didn't take part in this at all. There's no muscle tissue in your lungs at all. They are sacs. And so primarily here, the diaphragm is the thing that is doing the breathing for you here. It's mostly diaphragm. Okay, so it's important to note that when you do that, when you contract your diaphragm, you have to contract a muscle. That process uses energy. So we say that inhalation, breathing in, is an active process. Active process just means that it uses energy. You have to do inhalation. Inhalation is something that you do. So just to summarize there, you contract your diaphragm. It produces low pressure in your lungs relative to the outside air. And then air is going to move always from high pressure to low pressure. Now the high pressure is outside, the low pressure is inside your lungs, which is going to cause air to rush in and fill your lungs. That's the inhalation process. And you are right, Mohammed, that typically when you ask somebody to breathe and they are going to manually operate their respiratory system, they tend to inhale more air than a normal tidal volume, which would be just what you're breathing at rest. But you don't have to. You can breathe in and maintain your tidal volume, but I agree with you that it's there's something psychological about that people tend to breathe deeper when you ask them to breathe. Okay, so that's inhalation. That's how you get air into the lung. And I'm out of time, so I'm going to let you guys take a break here. I'm not going to let you. It is your break. You are welcome to it. And I will be back at 11:05. We're going to talk about exhalation. How do you get the air out of there? And then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some illnesses of the respiratory system. Hopefully that will leave you some time at the end of this block if you want to start your project, or there are some questions to work on as well. I'm fairly sure I'll have to double check that. But anyway, enjoy your break. I'm going to stop talking now. And I'll see you at 11:05. Okay, like I said, we're going to pick up where we left off. We were talking about mechanisms of ventilation, that is how your body actually ventilates, how you force air into the system. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I see it now, Ella. Good. Now I want you to consider the opposite. Okay, so you have inhaled. You've drawn breath. What do you have to do once you've inhaled in order to release the air from your lungs? Try it. Inhale. And then think about what you actually physically have to do to... What do you have to do? Is that an emoji air? No, sorry. Oh, no worries. Okay. I mean, you're exactly right here, Aaron. I mean, really the only thing you have to do... Yeah, exactly. Nadine, you got it too. You have to release. You have to stop contracting your diaphragm, essentially. So what's actually happening on exhalation is a passive process for the most part. And a passive process, again, just means that it doesn't require any energy. All you have to do is relax your diaphragm. So when you do that, when you actually do the relaxation, your lungs themselves are elastic. So they're not totally dissimilar to a balloon. So when you stop pulling on them to make them expand, they are naturally elastic. And so just like a balloon that's inflated, they're going to force air out of themselves on their own. So what that does is it creates a high pressure on the inside of the lung, and there's a relatively low pressure outside of the lung. And as we were just discussing with diffusion, gases are always going to move from high pressure to low pressure. So if you have high pressure on the inside and low pressure and they're connected with the tube, the gases are going to transform, meaning that they're going to move their location from inside of the lung to outside of the lung. So that's a passive process for the most part, which is just what I have summarized here. You relax your diaphragm, and just the natural elastic properties of the lungs just cause air to move out of them, basically. Air naturally flows out of the lungs. Now there's a slight caveat / addendum to this, and that is if you want to exhale forcefully, you want to increase how quickly air is being pushed out of your lungs, you can also increase your thoracic pressure. That is, increase how much you are pushing in on your lungs by contracting the muscles in between your ribs. So the muscles in between your ribs are called intercostals. They're these little muscles in between the rib right here, intercostal muscles. And when you contract your intercostals, you're increasing the pressure on your thoracic cavity, and so you just increase the rate at which you push air out. That's if you forcefully exhale, like go, you blow air essentially out of your mouth. And so you have the ability to do that as well. If you've ever blown up a balloon before, you've used this process, because the natural pressure that comes from just relaxing your diaphragm is not enough pressure to inflate a balloon. You actually have to push on the balloon. You have to push air into the balloon in order to inflate it. So in order to do that, you actually do have to utilize your intercostal muscles and increase the pressure in your thoracic cavity to force air out. So there isn't, I mentioned this here, that in order to speed up the process during exercise, you do need to use your intercostal muscles, those are between the ribs, to forcefully exhale. If you didn't do this during exercise, you wouldn't be able to ventilate fast enough to properly keep up with the oxygen needs of your body. Good question. Does the ability to hold more breath underwater? When you say hold more breath, Mohammed, do you mean hold more volume in your lungs, or hold your breath for a longer amount of time? It's actually a fascinating question that you've asked. I'm just trying to ferret out exactly what you are asking. What do you mean by hold more breath? Hold your breath for longer? Okay, for a longer amount of time. So in that case, it actually has nothing to do with Vo2 Max, although because you're not, the reason you can hold your breath for longer is actually more about you training yourself to cope with lower oxygen levels in the blood and to cope with higher CO2 levels in the blood. It's mostly on the CO2 end, because the higher the CO2 is in your blood, the more it's going to increase your urge to breathe. Your urge to breathe comes from detection of CO2 in your blood. So you can train yourself to become more essentially to ignore those signals, to ignore the urge to breathe signals that are coming from your lungs. And in some ways, your neurons can be trained to cope with lower oxygen, with a lower oxygen environment. And they do that through the production of certain proteins, which makes them more resistant to low oxygen environments. It's part of the mechanism that comes into play when you are living in a high altitude area for an extended period. Now, part of the living in the high altitude area is that you're going to increase your transport of oxygen, which would increase your Vo2 max. But there is also, on the cellular side, your cells are actually just becoming better adapted to operating on lower oxygen. And so that has to do with a number of proteins that are created at the cellular level. So that you're actually more training that system than you're training your endurance system or ability to transport oxygen. So the short answer to your question is that they're not really related to each other. I hope I answered your question. That's not really what you're training. So when you train breath hold, you're not improving your Vo2 max. And if you improve your Vo2 max, you are not increasing your ability to hold your breath. So those things are kind of mutually exclusive to each other. But it does lead me to the next thing that I wanted to discuss, which is perfect, which is that for the most part, your body really only detects carbon dioxide in your blood, not oxygen. You do have some mechanisms that your cells use to detect when oxygen is low. And as I mentioned, you do produce some proteins that help your cells cope with low amounts of oxygen. That's if you're experiencing low oxygen for a sustained period for a long amount of time. Maybe you're staying for a month at a high altitude or something like that. So there are some proteins that are being produced, and your cells can detect low oxygen in that way. But on a conscious level, that urge that you feel to breathe and your body's respiratory system that decides how often you should breathe, and that's subconscious, right? Like the number of times you breathe per minute, that's subconscious. Your body decides that. That is mostly based on carbon dioxide. And you can't detect carbon dioxide directly. So it's not like there are cells that are tuned to pick up a message and say, oh, we have too much carbon dioxide, or oh, we don't have enough. What they actually detect is pH. And going back to your grade 10, I don't know how much you guys talked about pH in grade 10 chemistry, but it is all about the amount of hydrogen that is dissolved in a particular fluid. And the more hydrogen that's dissolved in it, hydrogen ion that's dissolved in it, the more acidic it is. That's what makes something an acid. When you dissolve carbon dioxide in water, and you've all experienced this, by the way, if you've ever had a fizzy drink, you may have noticed that fizzy drinks have like a bite to them, to their flavor. That bite is caused by the CO2 being dissolved into water and producing carbonic acid, which is H2CO3. Again, hopefully something that you remember from grade 10. I don't know if you do. But that's the reaction that happens when you dissolve CO2 into water. You get it's dissolved in as carbonic acid. It's what gives the bite. And so if you've ever tasted like the difference between a carbonated drink and you've left the drink out overnight on your counter and then like tasted it again, a flat pop, you'll notice that like the bite is gone. The bite is gone from the pop, and that's because there's no carbonic acid left in it. It's all turned back into a gas again and left your drink. So you can't detect the CO2 directly, but you can detect the pH. There are a number of cells in your body that are pH sensitive. So basically, as the CO2 goes up in your blood, the pH goes down. There's more carbonic acid, the more CO2 you have. And when your body detects increased CO2, it says, breathe more. That's what initiates the increased breathing response. It's why when you start exercising, you naturally just breathe more. Because what your body is doing is it's detecting the carbonic acid in your blood and saying, oh, we got more CO2, increase your breathing rate. And this is interesting for all kinds of reasons. In the medical field, when a person is breathing fast, when you come into the hospital, okay, and you have to assess a person, you notice that they seem to be hyperventilating. They're breathing too fast. The reason, I mean, there are psychological reasons that people hyperventilate, so I should eliminate that first. So that you do have to eliminate that. But barring a psychological reason, people tend to be breathing faster because the pH of their blood is too low. And so that is going to open up some potential treatment modalities for this person. Why is the pH of this person's blood too low? Can you directly treat that? So sometimes you can directly treat low blood pH by adding a base or a buffer to the blood, which would raise the pH and potentially resolve their hyperventilation problem. Or again, so you have to figure out why the pH of a person's blood is too low. And there's lots of things that cause low blood pH, bacterial infections, all kinds of stuff. And so the breathing rate is directly related to the pH of the blood. And the opposite is true too. So if you have a patient coming in who's hypoventilating, that is, they're breathing very slowly, much slower than is normal, like 5 breaths per minute or something like that, the same thing is happening. There is too high of a pH in the blood. That's what causes people to breathe slowly. And so then you need to do some investigation and figure out, why is the blood pH too high? And again, this opens up all types of treatment modalities here in terms of treating high blood pH. So I wanted to mention that that really your breathing and what's regulating your breathing is the amount of CO2 in your blood for the most part. This also leads to a really interesting phenomenon that happens when you hyperventilate and then you hold your breath. So let's think about what happens to you if you hyperventilate and then you hold your breath. That's what my little graph is over here, by the way. So I want you to think about what happens to the CO2 in your lungs. Okay? So what's happening when you hyperventilate is you're basically removing 100% of the CO2 in your lungs. And when you do that, you remove extra CO2 from your blood. Okay? So the total amount of CO2, I'm going to use blue here for CO2. Let's say that you have a normal amount of CO2 in your blood. Okay, this is the normal amount that is eliminated. And so as the blood is leaving the lungs, it still has a little bit of CO2 and it doesn't have zero. So there's a certain amount. But then you hyperventilate and you completely remove all of the CO2 from the blood. Okay, you've removed all of it. So now it's gone down to virtually zero. It can't be actually zero, but close to zero. Okay, and the amount of oxygen in your blood is relatively stable. Even when you hyperventilate, you're still going to have roughly 100% saturation in your blood. It might go up a tiny, tiny little bit. So realistically, the graph for oxygen, so this is O2, the graph for oxygen in your blood is that it might go up a little bit when you hyperventilate, but it doesn't really go up very much because blood is usually completely saturated with O2 if you're ventilating enough. Okay? Then you hold your breath. All right? So there is a threshold of CO2 right here, that when you have this much CO2 in your blood, your body says, you got to breathe. That's if you hold your breath right now, you will feel an urge to breathe if you wait long enough. I mean, your body basically will force you to breathe. There's an urge. And so there's a certain cutoff, a certain CO2 level where you feel the urge to breathe. Okay? So normally, under normal circumstances, if you started holding your breath, the CO2 would start to drift up, and then you would hit a spot like right here in time where, and this is the bottom axis is time on my graph here, by the way. This is time. So the CO2 would start to drift up, and you would hit that threshold. I'll call it urge to breathe, and then you would breathe. Okay, if you were doing some scuba diving or not scuba diving. What's the other thing? Snorkeling. Okay, you'd be underwater and you would feel it. You would say, "Oh, I got to surface. I have to breathe right now." Okay, so normally that would happen relatively quickly. However, if you hyperventilate, you're eliminating extra CO2, and so what's happening is you're still going to build up the same amount of CO2 in your blood, right? It's still going to go up at the same rate because you're still using oxygen, producing CO2. Okay, but you're going to feel the urge to breathe way later. Okay, because you've eliminated so much extra CO2. So first of all, keep that in mind. It's delayed your urge to breathe. Normally, and you can't detect the O2, okay? Your O2 is going to get used up in your blood as you hold your breath. Okay, so it's going to drift down over time. And remember that this O2 cannot be detected. So what happens is, under normal circumstances, your urge to breathe is going to come long before you run out of oxygen. Long before your oxygen goes so low that you're unconscious, okay? Ideally, okay? However, if you delay that by hyperventilating and then holding your breath, well, by the time you are feeling the urge to breathe way down here, look at where your oxygen is. You have none left at that point by the time you feel the urge to breathe. And so what happens is somewhere around here, you are unconscious. Because you've run out of oxygen, but you still haven't felt the urge to breathe. Now, if you do that in a chair, or maybe if you're laying on the ground, it's not really of any consequence if you become unconscious, because when you become unconscious, you will begin breathing again automatically. You don't really have a choice in the matter. However, if you are in a place where you can't breathe, for example, you're holding your breath and you are snorkeling, if you suddenly become unconscious while you're underwater, that doesn't work anymore. You don't have the ability to breathe, and that can be very deadly. And in fact, this does lead to people dying when they are snorkeling. So if you're going to hyperventilate before you dive in water, I don't know what the rule is. I remember learning it when I took diving lessons, but I think it's 3 breaths maximum. You're supposed to hyperventilate, no more than 3 breaths. I'd have to look it up. I don't know what it is, but you don't want to hyperventilate a ton, then hold your breath and go snorkeling, because what ends up happening is you will go unconscious before you feel like you need to breathe. That's one of those weird quirks of your body not really being able to directly detect oxygen. You can detect CO2, but not oxygen. Kind of fascinating, eh? Okay. That's all I'm going to do with regards to talking about the mechanisms of breathing. What we're going to do right now is we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into some illnesses of the respiratory system. So what happens when this all breaks down? I'm going to go through several illnesses, and it's on the next page here. What I'm looking for you to summarize from each of these is the causes of each illness. So what causes it? What are the symptoms of the illness? So how do people experience it? And what are some of the potential treatment modalities? How could you potentially cure or at least treat the symptoms of this particular illness? Okay, so I'm going to go through 6 of them. The lung cancer one is not well explained on the slides, and so I'm actually just going to add it in here. I'll show it to you at the end, okay? Because it's not well described on the slides, so I'm going to come back for that. If you are looking for this presentation, if you want to have it open yourself, you're welcome to do that. I have it posted. Where is it? Yeah, I've linked the presentation I'll use here. If you click that link, you can look at the presentation yourself. Totally up to you if you're interested. I'm going to skip over some of these things at the beginning here. I mentioned respiratory rate. We talked about some of this stuff already, breathing in particulate matter and stuff like that. Essentially, there's a lot of things assaulting your lungs all the time. Particulate matter, potentially caustic chemicals, and they can have an effect potentially on your lungs. We talked about the anatomy already. So I'm going to start by discussing the idea of emphysema. So what is emphysema? You may have heard of it before, usually in relation to discussing smoking, although smoking is not the only cause. But really what emphysema is scarring of the alveoli. So we mentioned that the alveoli are very thin, very sensitive tissue at the terminal of the bronchioles where you actually do your gas exchange. And if you are continually assaulting the alveoli with particulate matter, with toxic chemicals, over time, you're going to cause permanent scarring to form. A small amount of damage is unavoidable. You're going to damage some of your alveoli through exposure to particulate matter and whatever over the course of your life. It's basically unavoidable. And to some extent, you can repair some of that damage. Once you're starting to get into an emphysema type of scarring, this is permanent. Once this much damage is occurring, there's really no mechanism in place for you to regenerate the tissue of your alveoli. So what it causes is small airway collapse. Those are the bronchioles, which really just means that a region of alveoli are no longer going to be accessible to air. It basically is going to scar off an area of the lungs so that there's no more airflow to that area of the lungs. So that means air really can't get in and out, and it becomes almost like a bubble inside of the lungs where there is no functional tissue inside the bubble. And when you get these bubbles forming, you get what's called a barrel chest, because if you can imagine, you're making areas of your lungs inelastic so that they can't be collapsed and they can't open up again like they normally would in the process of breathing. And so if you get these cavities of dead air inside of your lungs, you end up with like a barrel chest, a chest that's like expanded and can't be properly compressed. So that's part of what it looks like. How you experience that as coughing, difficulty breathing. This one is particularly noticeable because you have a lot of difficulty exhaling. Again, because you cannot collapse your airway all the way when you are trying to push air out. And then you get all of the different symptoms that are associated with not putting enough oxygen into your blood. So what happens when you don't get enough oxygen into your blood? You get weak because your muscles don't function. They're not receiving enough oxygen. You get anxiety, confusion, and then eventually it starts to damage tissues. It damages your heart tissue and causes heart failure. Because your lungs are not being perfused properly, you end up getting water. And this is related also to the heart failure, but you get edema, which is fluid that is accumulating in your lungs, and then eventually you get respiratory failure. So what respiratory failure is when you can no longer perfuse enough oxygen into your blood via diffusion in order to support your life. That's respiratory failure. And respiratory failure, when people die from things like influenza or COVID, it's usually as a result of respiratory failure. So due to whatever process is happening in the lungs, you can no longer perfuse enough gas into your blood to remain alive. So that's respiratory failure. And eventually emphysema does lead to respiratory failure eventually. So what causes emphysema? Primarily smoking. I mean, if you looked at all the causes of emphysema, smoking is far and away the most common cause. Pollution is also a cause. We don't have a lot of small particulate matter in the air here. And so the risk of just regular pollution causing permanent and severe lung damage is quite low here. But there are places in the world, especially in the developing world, where there is a lot of small particulate matter in the air, and the chances of getting emphysema from just normal air exposure, like polluted air exposure, is considerably higher. Obviously, age is a factor here because it's cumulative damage over your lifetime, and you can get scarring, emphysemal scarring from infections. It is possible. It doesn't happen a lot, but there are some infectious agents that also cause emphysema. Treatment. There is no good, well, there's no cure. There's no way to cure the scarification of your alveolar tissue. But we can increase the amount of oxygen being perfused into your blood by giving you 100% oxygen. And that's just going to increase that pressure that we talked about earlier of that diffusion gradient. It's going to force more oxygen across the barrier that you still have remaining. But there's no really way to cure it. So it's permanent damage. I'm going to show you some pictures of what it looks like. There's a diagram. On the right-hand side here is a CT scan of the lungs, specifically of lungs that have emphysema. And the black regions on there are the emphysemal regions. So the reason that they're black is that they are dead tissue. Essentially, they don't really have functional alveoli there any longer. So they're basically just dead tissue. I mean, some of the tissue is technically alive. It is being perfused with blood on the blood end, but it's not functional tissue on the alveolar side. So here, this is what it looks like in like an actual lung. So this is a smoker's lung, no surprise there. And you can see the black sort of bubble regions of dead tissue. They're usually distributed fairly evenly throughout the lungs, because obviously the smoke is getting everywhere, so it's causing damage everywhere as well. I think I show a healthy set of lungs later in this presentation, so you can see the difference. Yeah. I'll roll back, but this is the person on the right here actually has lung cancer, and you can see some. I'll write on there here. You can actually see the tumor tissue right here growing. There's other tumors here growing as well, but there's two large ones at the bottom. And this person also has a significant amount of emphysema. But to show you a picture of a healthy lung, which is on the left here, you'll notice that the coloration is also completely different. So that's what a normal set of healthy lungs looks like. They are pink. But if you are constantly smoking, you're just not able to remove the particulate matter. I mentioned that the ciliated epithelium of the lungs is paralyzed by smoking. So if you're smoking all the time, you do get accumulation of junk in your lungs. And in the long term, they end up looking like that, which is not great. Yeah, let's talk about asthma. So what's asthma? You have muscle, a layer of muscle that goes around, it circles all of your bronchioles and bronchi. Okay, so I'm going to jump back to that slide in a second, but if you look at a normal bronchiole, you can actually see that there is a layer of muscle, that's this muscle right here, that wraps around your bronchi and bronchioles. It doesn't really have a function. Not that I'm aware of. It probably was functional in some previous evolutionary iteration, but for modern humans, there doesn't appear to be any function to this muscle tissue. And in a normal, healthy adult or child, it doesn't do anything. So you don't really use that muscle tissue that is lining your bronchioles. However, in individuals with asthma, they have a tendency to get inflammation, first of all, on the inside of the bronchiole, which causes swelling. And that swelling is made much worse by the fact that the muscles around the bronchioles constrict. And so they'll constrict and actually narrow the bronchioles, making it much harder to push air through the tiny airways. What happens when you get that constriction of your airways? Coughing, Mucus is secreted. That's part of the inflammatory response. So it's kind of a mix between an immune response and a maladaptive muscle contraction. So those two things kind of go hand in hand with each other. One kind of enhances the other. We don't really there seems to be a higher incidence of asthma in young children in the last 25 years that we're not really 100% sure of the cause. It's unlikely to be due to environmental, or at least as far as I'm aware, it's unlikely to be due to environmental triggers for asthma. I think there is some thought that the increase in childhood asthma may actually be because of the opposite, because children tend to be less exposed to potential allergens, and therefore their immune systems are not primed to deal with particular allergens. So when they do become exposed to them, there is an overreaction from the immune system to particular allergens. That's my understanding of like the current sort of theory around why we're seeing more asthma than we did previously. And essentially, kids are not going outside as much, and they're not being as exposed to allergens. Now, that's obviously not the only reason that people get asthma. There is hereditary asthma, people that are genetically predisposed to getting asthma, and there's a number of other causes. But I'm talking about the recent increase in cases. It can be fatal, so you can have an asthma attack that restricts your airflow and causes you to suffocate. The attacks are typically precipitated by allergen inhalation, and so I mentioned that immune response that takes place. It's usually in response to something, although they can be triggered by emotional stress as well. So what do you do? What do you do if you have asthma already? Well, there are two different types of inhalers that are typically used to treat asthma, and they both have a different reason for use. So the one, the bronchodilator, and bronchodilation just means to increase or dilate the vessels of the bronchioles, make them larger. Those bronchodilators are essentially muscle relaxants that you spray into your lungs. So when you spray a muscle relaxant in there, it just relaxes the muscles, and then the airway will expand. That's the type of inhaler that you use in an emergency during an asthma attack. More long term, you can take another type of inhaler, which is an immunosuppressor. It's usually a type of steroid. And what that does is it just reduces the immune response of the cells on the lining of your bronchioles. So it tends to decrease how aggressively your immune system responds when it's exposed to those allergens. So if you decrease the inflammation and blood flow to those tissues, you're not going to get as much swelling, and then the bronchodilation or the bronchoconstriction is not quite as severe. So those two treatments usually go hand in hand, and people I think are normally treated for both. I'm sorry, Ryan. I'm sorry, Mohammed. I just noticed your comment here. Does smoking weed and normal cigarettes have the same effect on your lungs? In terms of smoke, like the particulate matter in smoke, the reactive oxygen species in smoke, the carcinogens that are contained in smoke, those are the same. So there's no difference in terms of your exposure to various carcinogens between cigarette smoke and cannabis smoke. The difference comes from how often exposure results in cancer. So when we're talking about emphysema, there's no difference. People get emphysema with cannabis smoke, and people get emphysema with cigarette smoke, as far as I know, at the exact same rate. There's no difference in terms of how that affects your lungs. With regards to cancer, the answer is a little bit more complex, because my understanding is that cannabinoids, which are one of the ingredients in cannabis, have some type of tumor suppressing action, which means that they are less likely to potentially trigger tumor growth in the lungs. In other words, they are potentially causing a restriction in the amount of tumor growth. Now, that's not to say that you can't get lung cancer when you are smoking cannabis. Far from it. Plenty of people get lung cancer from smoking cannabis. The rate that you get lung cancer when smoking cannabis if you're looking at the same rate of smoking, is slightly lower for cannabis smokers than it is for smokers of traditional cigarettes. However, I don't think that mechanism is well understood, and that it's not to say that smoking cannabis does not increase your chance of getting lung cancer. That is not true. It just appears that there is a slightly lower increase in the amount of lung cancer for cannabis smokers. And the exact reasoning behind that I don't think is fully understood. But anyway, so there is a minor difference between the two, but it's certainly nothing I would write home about. Does it greatly increase your chance of getting lung cancer when you smoke cannabis? Yes, it does. So I would say most of that information out there, and when it's described by people, is borderline propaganda, because people have agendas when they advertise that information, and they're very selectively presenting you with facts about cannabis smoke. Certainly, all the other ill effects of smoking are the same, and there is only a minor difference in the rates of lung cancer that occur with cannabis smoking. It's not people who smoke cannabis like to pretend that it's like some kind of magical, no one ever gets lung cancer when they're smoking cannabis. That is absolutely not true. So anyway, I just throw that out there because I've heard those arguments made before by people. So, but there's no facts to back that up. Right, asthma, we talked about the swelling. Triggers for asthma, we mentioned there's a whole host of allergens that could potentially be responsible. All kinds of stuff out there. Bronchitis. Anytime you see the word itis in medicine, it always just means inflammation of. Any itis. Pancreatitis, inflammation of your pancreas. Gastroenteritis, inflammation of your digestive system, usually of the small and large intestine. Hepatitis, inflammation of the liver. You name it. Any itis. So an itis is just an inflammation. It doesn't necessarily refer to the cause of the itis. So bronchitis can be caused by a whole bunch of different things. It just means that your bronchioles and your bronchi are inflamed. So what is causing that inflammation? Well, often it's an infection. So when people say that they have bronchitis, usually they mean that they have some type of lower respiratory tract infection, usually. However, you can irritate the bronchioles and the bronchi with all kinds of things. From inhalation of some type of chemical irritant, from inhalation of an allergen, you name it. Anything that you could potentially irritate your lungs with from breathing it in can cause bronchitis. So it's not specifically an infection by itself, but it's often caused by infection. So how do you know if you have bronchitis? It's usually a cough that has sputum, so it's when you're coughing up stuff, and then it's associated with shortness of breath and wheezing. That wheezing sound is water or liquid, sometimes mucus, and you're like basically blowing air across the mucus, and it has like a sound when you're breathing out. That's what they're listening for with the stethoscope when they put it on your chest, or at least one of the things they could potentially listen for, is do you have that wheezing sound. And that's from the inflammatory response that's taking place in your bronchioles. So that's how it's going to present itself. There are some things that exacerbate bronchitis or are likely to cause bronchitis. Again, you'll see smoking a lot in this presentation. Smoking increases your chances of getting bronchitis significantly. So does vaping, by the way. So that's one thing that vaping and smoking have in common. There's quite a bit more. Well, it can be a lung irritant, to put it simply. The bronchitis can be associated with vaping. Pollution, and I already mentioned bacterial and viral infections are the cause. So what do you do to treat it? Well, you have to treat the cause. So if you have an infection, if it's viral, usually there's nothing you can do. So I'll give you an example. COVID causes bronchitis, as does the flu, influenza. What do you do to treat that? Nothing. There's very little you can actually do Now, I should say that when you're having severe respiratory problems, you can treat those with oxygen. And we do have some other therapies that we use for COVID now other than oxygen therapy. But realistically, for a viral infection, there's nothing you can do. There's no real treatments for those. If it's bacterial, you can treat them with antibiotics. And sometimes we'll treat viral illnesses like that with antibiotics as well, just to prevent a bacterial infection from happening secondarily to the viral infection. So that sometimes that makes sense to do that. If it's from some other type of injury to the lung, from heat or chemical injury, usually you just have to wait. So you have to wait that out and wait for your lung tissue to heal. So again, this looks very similar to what you see with an asthma attack, but the main difference here is that the musculature, which is this band on the outside, and again the band right here, is not constricted. So this is not enhanced, and it doesn't go hand in hand with muscle constriction. If you get sort of a bronchitis with muscle constriction, that's asthma. But just straight bronchitis is not associated with muscle constriction in the bronchioles. So that's the main difference between them. Pneumonia. Pneumonia, often misspelled, often confused with other words that start with P. Pneumonia is an inflammation, kind of like bronchitis, except this is taking place in the alveoli. So when you have inflammation in your alveoli, there is a tendency for the alveoli to fill with fluid. So the fluid starts passing across that membrane from the blood into the alveoli itself. And yes, obviously it's problematic. If there's a bunch of fluid in there, you're going to lower your ability to pass gas, pass oxygen into your blood, and pass CO2 out of your blood. So what causes pneumonia? Bacterial infection, viral infection, fungal infection, various parasites cause it. Anything that could potentially cause an injury to the alveoli. And chemical injury as well. So if you're breathing something in that's damaging the alveoli, if you are in a house fire or in a fire and you breathe in extremely hot air, you can burn your alveoli. So all of those things can potentially be injurious to the alveoli and then cause fluid retention. So when this happens at the alveolar level, it causes difficulty breathing, obviously. Chest pain. These are usually associated with fever. Pneumonia is often associated with fever and coughing. Anyone can get pneumonia, any age group. It's much more severe if you're very old or very young. If you look at the pneumonal incidence that causes death, especially for something like the flu is a great example. You'll notice that people that die from the flu are usually very old or very young. That's the most likely. You're usually, if you get the flu, your prognosis is usually pretty good, unless you're very old or very young, or chronically ill. You have some type of secondary health condition, and this has come out with COVID too. The same is true that the very old are the ones that are the most deeply affected by COVID. Although that's not to say that other age groups are not affected. You can die at any age. You're just much less likely to do so. So older people are by far the most affected. Strangely, for COVID, the very young tend not to be strongly affected, we don't really actually understand that mechanism. So that is counter to the normal statistics for lung infections. Usually the very young are also very adversely affected by them, but that doesn't hold true for COVID. And we're not entirely sure, as far as I'm aware, we're not entirely sure of the reasoning for that. But anyway, it does affect the very old. If you have bacterial pneumonia, it's caused by a bacterial infection, you will have antibiotics. If your physician is worried about a bacterial infection happening as a result of something else, like you have a heat injury or a chemical injury, and they're worried about you getting a bacterial infection, they may give you antibiotics anyway. You're probably going to be put on oxygen. And other than that, it's hope is the other treatment. So there's not really a lot of other stuff that you can do. So you try and allow them to perfuse oxygen as best you can, then you hope that their immune system is going to take care of the rest. This is what pneumonia looks like on an X-ray. You can see that there is some fluid retention occurring inside of the lungs. And this is one of the methods to use to diagnose pneumonia. It's fairly visible on an X-ray. It's that cloud, basically, that you're seeing there, little pockets. Normally that would be completely clear. You wouldn't see anything there. TB, not something that you guys worry about too often here in North America. TB is quite rare in North America. It's an infectious illness caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and it causes something called lung tubercles. A tubercle is basically a very large colony of bacteria that is so big that it's macroscopic. It looks like a pocket of bacteria growing in the lungs. It is one form of tuberculosis. You can get tuberculosis in all kinds of tissues, in the neural tissue, in the brain, and it can also move from the lungs into other tissues. Those are much more dangerous than lung tuberculosis. You can have it in your liver and in your intestines and all over the place. But it doesn't tend to transfer very easily from person to person, not like lung tuberculosis, which people just cough and you can just get TB from somebody coughing on you. So it used to be one of the scourges of mankind. TB was very difficult to treat, often fatal. It's very uncommon in North America, but in places like India, it's still very common. I believe that Russia also has a problem with TB. We're lucky here in that it's just not very common in the population, and we tend to do a fairly good job treating TB here so that it doesn't become problematic. But luckily, for the most part, it can be treated with antibiotics. Now, there are drug-resistant forms of TB, and unfortunately, there are some strains that are multi-drug resistant. We talked about drug resistance in the first unit. So we've done a bad job with that. And so there are some strains of TB that are pretty much untreatable, but they're quite rare, thankfully. They're still quite rare. As I mentioned, you can get TB anywhere, but the lungs is the most common. And what does it look like? Cough. The cough in this particular case often is tinged with blood. So the inflammation that's caused by the tubercles can cause bleeding in the lungs, and so there's blood in the sputum. Fever is associated. It's a bacterial infection, so you often get a fever. Night sweats are common, and weight loss, especially if you have TB in the long term, is also very common. And that's why in the 18th century, early 19th century, before the invention of antibiotics, it was referred to as consumption, because people would kind of just waste away when they got TB. You just get thinner and thinner and thinner, which is part of the mechanism of TB. Here's some little posters about not spitting in public or whatever to prevent the spread of TB, which is good advice, by the way. It used to be really, really problematic in North America as well. Worldwide, TB was extremely problematic. We just do a lot better job of treating it now, so it doesn't tend to be as big of a deal. Lung cancer. Hold on, I think did I do a separate thing for lung cancer here? Yes. Oh, wait. That's what it is. This little section here in your book, I believe, is shown as asbestos or asbestosis. Just as a heads up, that section right there should be labeled lung cancer. I'm going to mention asbestosis, which is a cause of lung cancer, but I'm not going to be looking into asbestosis as a individual illness. I'm just going to discuss it sort of as an aside. So you're going to want to relabel this one right here as lung cancer, because that's really what we're going to be talking about, lung cancer in general. I'm going to mention asbestos, but we're not going to be looking too deeply into asbestosis. So what's lung cancer? You would have talked in grade 10 about what cancer is in general. It's when you have a group of cells that is no longer regulating its mitosis. So it is dividing uncontrollably. Oftentimes it is taking on the appearance of tissue that it's no longer the correct tissue. It's doing an unusual job that it wasn't meant to do before. It's producing hormones or doing something inappropriate. And it comes from damaging your DNA. If you damage the DNA of a cell, if you damage the parts of the DNA that regulate cell growth and reproduction, eventually, if you damage the right parts, you're going to get a group of cells that just does its own thing. It's going to start growing out of control. It's not recognized by your immune system because it's your own cells. And eventually, it's going to start drawing so many resources away from your own cells that you can no longer live at the same time as the cancerous growth. So, lung cancer is real. Ugh. It's mostly preventable. About half of all cases are caused by smoking. In North America, it's more than half. We don't have as many pollution-related lung cancers in North America any longer, thankfully. So more than half of lung cancers are caused by smoking here. The other main cause of lung cancer is surprisingly radon. It's not something that you would think of. Radon is an element on the periodic table. It's a noble gas, which is on the group 18, right? The far right group of the periodic table. And it's radioactive. And radon is emitted as one of the breakdown products of one of the heavy metals that are found in bedrock. So if your home is built on bedrock, or you have granite countertops, which is basically bedrock that you've put in your house, you may have radon in your home because those materials tend to leach radon. It just leaches out of the stone. It's very heavy. It's an extremely dense gas. It's very low on the periodic table. It's a dense gas, and it has a tendency to accumulate in basements. So if you inhale it, as it breaks down, it's radioactive. So as it decays radioactively, the gamma rays and beta and alpha particles that it releases damage the tissue on the inside of your lungs. So you can get test kits for this at the hardware store if you're concerned about having radon in your home. We don't live on the Canadian Shield, so it's not as common here to have radon in the house. Radon in the house. But it does happen, and certainly if you have granite countertops, it's possible that your granite countertops are leaching radon into your home. It's not super common, but it absolutely does happen. So if you're concerned, you can check. But it does cause a relatively large proportion of lung cancers, which is kind of unfortunate. I mean, I guess it makes sense that breathing in a radioactive gas is going to cause lung cancer, but you wouldn't think that you'd find it in your home. It has a very high mortality rate for a cancer. It is the second most common cancer for men and women, at least in Canada. The first most common cancer for men is prostate cancer, and for women it's breast. However, if you look at the deadliest cancer, even though lung cancer is the second most common, it is far and away the deadliest cancer. And part of the problem with that is it is extremely difficult to treat. I mentioned earlier about how difficult it is to operate on the lungs. It's a chore because it's so vascularized that it's very difficult to cut pieces out of the lungs. So you're limited in how much lung tissue you can remove. Obviously, if you remove too much, the patient is going to die. And the secondary problem is that lung cancer has this unfortunate tendency to metastasize. So metastasizing is when cancer goes from one tissue and it basically travels to a new place in the body and sets up shop. So you'll start growing lung tissue in your brain or in your blood vessels or in your pancreas or whatever. It just moves to a neighboring tissue and sets up shop. And lung cancer has a really unfortunate tendency to do that, as does melanoma, which is one of the major problems with melanoma as well. But anyway, that's a big problem for lung cancer. It's also a horrible way to die. I'm sorry if anybody has ever had to experience that. I know I've seen somebody die from lung cancer. It is not a pleasant way to go. you are losing your ability to breathe simultaneously as you are being overcome with cancer. So it's very unfortunate. It's a sad way to die. And I think my main issue with the lung cancer is that far and away it is preventable. You don't have to get lung cancer. So I would urge people, if you're a smoker, or if you ever thought about starting smoking, please don't do that. There are lots of other things you can do, guys. If you're using it as a stress reliever or whatever, there's lots of other things you can do. But don't start smoking. Don't do it to yourself. I know all the reasons why. I know why people smoke. It's not like I don't understand it from a social perspective or even from a physiological perspective. It's very relaxing. However, the effects that it has on your body are just terrible. And it's extremely difficult to quit. I can't tell you how often I've heard my friends say, I wish I never started smoking. I hear that from some of my friends all the time. It's so sad. But anyway, just don't do that to yourself. It's my very strong recommendation. Anyway, so what happens? Again, you get bloody sputum, cough, difficulty breathing, chest pain. It's often associated with emphysema because people can have both, obviously. If you've been smoking for a lifetime, you often have both. Smoking leads to a 10 times increase in developing lung cancer. I mean, obviously it causes it directly. It's not a guarantee. Smoking is not a guarantee that you get lung cancer, but it certainly vastly increases your risk. It's mentioned here that some lung cancers are operable, many are not. It variably has an ability to respond to chemotherapy. Sometimes it responds well and sometimes it doesn't, but it has a tendency not to respond well to chemo. Anyway, it's a nightmare. So I don't want to get any more detail about lung cancer. It's a terrible illness. I probably said everything that I need to say. This is an individual who's had part of their lung removed as part of a lung cancer operation. There are various ways that you can remove masses from the lungs depending on where they're located. I'm not going to get into too much detail there. We've already talked about what cancer is. There's a lung with some cancer on the right. We don't do the human dissection lab anymore. I'm not going to get too much into this. I mentioned the effects of cigarette smoking a number of times already. I'm not going to hit it over the head again and again. The rates of smoking in Canada have gone down significantly in the last 10 years. It seems like people are getting the message. So that's a positive thing. I mentioned already this idea of smoking paralyzing the cilia and the ciliated epithelium, which makes it obviously more prone to lung infections. There's a cool picture of the ciliated epithelium from an electron microscope, so you can see those little hairs in a little bit more detail. Really cool. This isn't on your sheet. I'm going to skip over it for time. The one last thing that I wanted to mention was asbestosis. So that originally was on your sheet. Asbestosis is caused by asbestos. And if you look at an asbestos particle, in fact, actually, I'm going to show you an asbestos particle. Electron micrograph. There we go. So if you look at it really closely under an electron microscope, you'll notice that it is barbed. It's a mineral, so you mine this out of the earth, and it is this barbed shape that is what makes it so problematic. These particles are very small. They are maybe 1.5 microns wide or something like that, so they're easily inhaled. They go deep into the lungs, into the alveoli, and because of this barbed shape, they have a tendency to really stick deep into your alveolar tissue, and they're basically unremovable once they get in there. So that might not sound like a huge deal. So you have this inert mineral in there, but the problem is that it causes inflammation of the alveoli when it gets wedged in there. And we don't really have time to dig too deep into what chronic inflammation does to the body in this course. You can take whole courses on this in university. But when you continuously inflame a tissue over and over and over again, or in the long term, you have some interaction with reactive oxygen species and all these other things that are produced during that inflammatory response. And eventually, it leads to mutation. It actually causes cell division and mutation, and is one of the potential triggers for lung cancer. So asbestosis is essentially scarring that happens in the alveoli that has led to tumor growth. So that's why I don't do this one separately. I just talk about lung cancer instead, because basically this causes lung cancer because of the long-term inflammation that it causes in the lungs. So you might be wondering, okay, well, this mineral does that. Why do we have this mineral? Why would anyone ever use asbestos for anything? It seems like such a terrible idea. Well, we didn't know that asbestos did this for a long time. And actually, there's some evidence to suggest that we probably knew about it for a long time and continued using it anyway. I don't want to be a purveyor of conspiracy theories here, but let's just say that it was in industry's interest to continue to use it for a long time. It was economically viable when the negative effects of asbestos were well known. To put that into clearer focus, Canada was an exporter of asbestos until 5 years ago. Obviously, we knew that it caused cancer, and there are alternatives to asbestos that are much better. But we permitted that to be mined and exported from Canada while you were alive. I mean that's absolutely outrageous. That it makes me extremely angry. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. We have to do better, obviously. But what I have on the website is I just threw up a little video here. This video is from 1942, and just talking about all the wonderful uses of asbestos. I think this is a promotional video made by an asbestos manufacturer, but certainly for well over 100 years, we've used asbestos as a fireproofer, to make composite materials that are fireproof. That's its main function, is to use it in fireproofing, for many, many years. So it had lots of different uses. We put it in insulation, we put it into fabrics, we put it into all kinds of things. When I started teaching, there was asbestos everywhere. In the chemistry lab, we used asbestos gloves, we used asbestos pads. Asbestos was everywhere. I didn't start teaching that long ago. Like, it was still prevalent. Up until 2 years ago, KCI still had asbestos insulation in the ceiling. But we had it removed 2 years ago. But it's pretty crazy. Oh, yeah. That's such an awesome story too, Brie. I wonder if I can find that scene on YouTube. It was used on The Wizard of Oz as a set decoration. It's used in many movies. If you look at old black and white films from the 30s, 40s, 50s, anytime that you see snow in a film from that time period, that's asbestos. They just rained asbestos down on the actors to use it as snow, because it basically looks like snow on film. Crazy. Obviously, people are inhaling tremendous amounts of it when you're doing that. But to be perfectly honest, in that time period, in the 30s and 40s, there was very little evidence to show that it was causing asbestosis at that time, causing lung cancer. Now, as of the 1950s, I think that there was a general awareness, but The Wizard of Oz was made in 1935? It was made in the 1930s, so I'm fairly confident that they did not know about the negative effects of asbestos back then. But anyway, used for many, many years in movies, used as an insulator. It's mostly removed from schools in our region now, but again, it's used everywhere. So if you're curious, I think it's a fun little video. It talks about some of the uses of asbestos, and you get a feel for how common it is by watching it. I'm gonna stop now. I've gone through the illnesses that I'm going to discuss. We have a little bit of extra time, and you can use it for whatever you'd like. If you want to start working on the medical technology project, you're welcome to do that. There's no little EXA quiz or anything from this content. I should probably consider making one for this content. I don't have one for this yet, but one thing that you could consider watching, I have a video here from a YouTube channel called Chubby Emu. I don't know if anybody's heard of this before. It is a really cool YouTube channel where they essentially follow a diagnosis of a particular medical condition. I know that sounds very dry, but they're always caused by something fascinating. This one, for example, is about a young man who ate 3 laundry pods, Tide pods, for the views, I guess. Now, wasn't intending to actually eat them, just put them in his mouth. However, due to some reasons which are explained very well in the video, once you put that stuff in your mouth, it's very difficult not to inhale it. It causes you to choke and sputter pretty much the moment it enters your mouth. And if you inhale it and get some of that laundry pod into your lungs, you're going to have a bad time. So the video goes through basically the diagnosis and treatment of this person, and it's done in a very layperson way. These are accessible videos. They're pretty much done at a level that pretty much anyone can understand. And certainly you guys who have just discussed the respiratory system in some detail, you have a lot more knowledge to base your understanding on than probably the average person does. But the reason I put it up here is because they talk a lot here about the respiratory system and where the respiratory system is fragile and how this laundry pod potentially interacts with the physiology of the respiratory system. And so it's probably a good review of what we've just been talking about. Not to mention, it's very fascinating just to find out what happens. If you're interested to see what happened to this guy, what the treatment would be, and I highly recommend this. It's a fun video. I'll try and find more of these. There's one for basically every system you can think of. It's a great YouTube channel, but I'll leave it up to you if you want to watch that. I'm going to stop now. We're done a little bit early today, which is nice. If you want to work on your project, you're welcome to. I will still be here in the chat. If you guys have any questions about any content, questions about working on your project, I'll be there in the Google Meet as well. So if you want to come and drop in the Google Meet, you want to talk about anything in particular, you want to talk about what your topic is, or you're looking for research sources or whatever you like, I'll be in the Google Meet from 1 to 2:05 as normal. Okay, guys, I'm going to let you go. We're done a little early today. Hooray!